Welcome back to Switch to Linux. It is time for another outdoor philosophy. And the overwhelming majority of people, when I pose the question as to which book we should look at next, most people wanted the Lucifer Principle. Not sure why. I was kind of leaning towards that emotional intelligence thing, business, things like that. But okay, we'll discuss violence and hatred, which is probably an okay thing to discuss in this day and age. Because everything is all tied together. This is a fabulous principle I learned myself as a young man, is that everything itself is all interconnected. And we have to keep that perspective in mind. And the Lucifer Principle, now, here's the thing about the Lucifer Principle, is that it is a book that talks about the nature and the evil of man from a scientific and a humanist perspective. So I actually understand a lot of the philosophy behind it and go, yeah, that philosophy is not quite true. But unfortunately, a lot of that ties in directly with the Christian view. And so I thought this would also be a great opportunity to cross-promote the two channels. So anything that is an overly Christianized view or opinion about the things we read, I'm going to do videos on the Christian channel rebutting it. Anything dealing directly with the philosophy or the heart of the matter is going to be here as we dive into this and ask ourselves this question. Are we getting all of this violence coming down the pipeline in America today? Are we getting all of this violence because the Lucifer Principle is at work, this innate human evil within us? And is that related to biology and evolution, or is it related to some form of God or deity? That is ultimately the question. Now, the author of this book, who is Howard Bloom, is an absolute humanist evolutionist. He cannot bring himself to understand that there's a God, and he's convinced himself. Okay, I disagree, but I am absolutely into it. And it just kind of reminds me of a little thing. When I see people, well, that was a 2-minute long gust of wind. All right, so when I see somebody homeschooling their kids so that they do not learn about evil evolution, I think there's a kid who's going to become a biological humanist. Because the reality is we need to openly talk about and discuss these principles, whether we agree with them or not. And that's what we will get to in the Lucifer Principle. So there will be a link to my Amazon to the Lucifer Principle in the description down below throughout the whole series. Now, this book is broken down into a lot of different subheadings. There's no specific chapters, maybe chapters. So what I'm going to do is each section, which is 4 to 7 quote-unquote quasi-chapters, will make up each one of these. And so that means that we should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 10 to 12 videos on this. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the basic introduction, because the introduction itself contained 4 different subsections. And then it moves on to the next section, which is called Bloodstains in Paradise. So this is how we're going to get why humans self-destruct. One man's God is another man's devil. So these are the chapters we're going to be talking about in this outdoor philosophy. And some people may say, what does this have to do with Linux? I get this all the time. What does this have to do with Linux? People, I switched to Linux out of philosophy, not out of a geeky operating system. Linux itself, for me, is an overarching view for the worldviews we as people adopt, and we've got to start questioning parts of our worldviews. So, first and foremost there was a quote from the introduction, or from the foreword rather, that I enjoyed, and it's a quote that we can carry on with us. All right, so let me read the last paragraph here of the foreword, which is by David Sloan Wilson. I don't know who that is. It says, as a scientist who has been developing a hierarchical view of evolution from within academia, I have learned from Howard Bloom and value him as a fellow traveler. I do not agree with everything he says, and I sometimes blush at the way he says it. Not with a reserve of a scientist, but with the brashness of a mass media denizen. Of course, that only makes the book fun for the average reader. Many of Howard Bloom's ideas must be passed through the scientific verification machine before they can be accepted. Until then, your motto for the Lucifer Principle should not be read it and believe, but read it and think. And that's what we want to do. We want to read this, we want to talk about it, and we want to discuss it down in the comments below and see what we get. I think there was another quote in here I really liked as well. Let's see if I can find it. This is it. This is kind of at the beginning of the book. There's 3 quotes. This is from Alexander, I don't even, I'm not going to be able to pronounce any of those names. It says, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart. All right. So we start in the first section of the book talking about who is Lucifer. Now, of course, in this book, being somebody who denies all aspects of faith and believes exclusively in humanism, either modernism or postmodernism. I seem to feel a modernist philosophy in this more than a postmodernist philosophy. But I sense one of those two philosophies in here. But as one of those two philosophies, as a humanist, as an evolutionist, he will absolutely deny anything having to do with God and denigrate all of the faith part aspects of his life into the realm of myth. And so he starts up with talking about who is Lucifer, talking about the martyrdom of Marcion, who I discuss Marcion in great detail in the Christian video that I will go ahead and card wherever it happens to be carded. You can look at that video for more detail. The first of it, say 20 minutes of that video is that. Everything else is dealing with comments and questions. But then they get in here and they talk about more traditional Christians found another way of dealing with the problem of evil. They created the myth of Lucifer, is what they say. Now, I believe in a real devil, not some created myth. And there are reasons for it that are beyond the scope of this video because that dives way too far into the Christian aspect. So I've dealt with them on that other video. You can go take a look at that video to figure that out. All right. But regardless, what the first principle is, and this is the thing about the book and this philosophy, coming from the Christian perspective, where I understand and believe in the doctrine of the total depravity, not meaning that man is completely evil, but that all aspects of man are impacted by evil. That's what total depravity means. And what that means in the scope of this is that he looks at this and says, this is all just biology, it's evolutionary means, and all just biology, all evolutionary means, and what I happen to take it on as we as human beings are inherently sinful. We sin because we are sinners at our heart. And that's kind of the approach that I am taking. So he talks about this question of who is Lucifer, and then as he's discussing who is Lucifer, he gets into all of this, that we create our devils to excuse our evils and things like this. And no, we don't need a devil to excuse our evils. We in ourselves naturally gravitate towards those. We don't have to, but we do. And that's kind of the point of a lot of the studies that I do on the other channel. Now he goes into the next section is the Clint Eastwood conundrum, which is more about the media part. So this guy approaches this from a media type perspective, which is a very fascinating approach. And he kind of talks though about what he's talking about in this is this cultural move towards what socially drives us. And I've noted this as well. There was this mob influence. Was it George Carlin? I believe he said, individuals I love, but when you get groups of individuals together, they produce terrifying consequences. He says it better than I said it there. But that's one of the things that he is oftentimes quoted as saying, that individual people will behave a whole lot different than mobs. In fact, I talk about this analogy on the Christian channel a lot. When people, if you look in what we call the triumphal entry in the Gospels, when the historical character of Jesus is entering Jerusalem, a whole ton of people were praising Hosanna in the highest, laying down palm trees, accepting Jesus entering into the city. Not even a week later, that same crowd of people was shouting, "Crucify him." We get caught up in a mob mentality, and that's what he's talking about here, is that on the individuals, we as individuals, and any individual person is a good and calm and reasonable person, but when you gather them together inside of groups and gangs, we tend to produce some of these most horrible results. And we see that in business, we see that in life, we see that in gangs, we see that in cities. An individual person walking down the street is no big deal, but when you get groups of young teenagers, they start to one-up each other in the various things that they want to do. So this leads into Bloom's next section, which is called the hole is bigger than the sum of its parts. And this is where he really dives into this entire principle about the cultural thing. And then he derives 5 basic premises about the Lucifer Principle. So I will go ahead and read these. Concept number 1, the principle of self-organizing systems, replicators, bits of structure that function as mini factories assembling raw materials, then churning out intricate products. These natural assembly units, genes are one example, crank out their goods so cheaply that the end results are appallingly expendable. Among those expendable products are you and me. So of course, we are nothing, we go back to nothing. All right, concept number 2 is the superorganism. We are not the rugged individuals we would like to be. We are instead disposable parts of being much larger than ourselves. Concept number 3 is the meme, the self-replicating cluster of ideas. Here on YouTube, we know all about memes. Self-replicating cluster of ideas. Thanks to the handful of biological tricks, these visions become the glue that holds together civilizations, giving each culture its distinctive shape, making some intolerant of dissonant and others open to diversity. They are the tools of which we unlock the forces of nature. Our visions bestow the dream of peace, but they also turn us into killers. And concept number 4. The neural net, the group mind whose eccentric mode of operation manipulates our emotions and turns us into components of a massive learning machine. And concept number 5 is the pecking order. The naturalist who discovers the dominance hierarchy in the Norwegian farmyard calls it the key to despotism. Pecking orders exist among men, monkeys, wasps, and even nations. They help explain why the danger of barbarians is real and why the assumptions of our foreign policies are often wrong. And that is 5 very good concepts for diagnosing the human heart. And this is why there is nothing in this that is inconsistent with the Christian thought. But you can check out the other channel for more information on that. The last section on this is called the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and I'm not going to read many excerpts from that. It just kind of talks about how Mao Zedong organized China. First, he did a cultural revolution where he wanted to exceed the growth of everyone else. And then after that, when that failed, because it often will, then he figured out how to breed discontent and allowed basically ruling mobs of young people get out there and start destroying things quite literally. And that is really at the heart of what he introduces to us as the Lucifer Principle, the innateness evil in us. Now, of course, I approach it to say this is simply the result of original sin. He approaches it as saying this is the result of evolutionary biology. So we will continue to read through the book and see what he has to say. I hope you enjoy this. I hope you pick up a copy of the book and read it along with us so you can get it. It's one thing to listen to a guy talk about a book, and there's a lot of value to that, but there's so much more in actually picking up, reading it, and following along. Again, we will attempt to do one of those large sections each week. It may or may not happen quite on that schedule. But that's kind of what I'm going to attempt to do. And check out the Christian channel for the more Christian analysis of some of the things. I'm going to try and keep this channel more on the philosophy. I'm going to keep that channel more on the Christian rebuttal. So that way, if you don't care for that kind of stuff, just don't go there. And I'm going to try and keep the Christian type stuff to a minimum here because that's not necessarily the demographic of this channel. So thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.